Good evening, everybody. My name is Wyatt Wegerson. I am one of the owners here at Bookworks. We took over the bookstore 11 years ago on October 1st. So we are celebrating as new owners 11 years, but the bookstore has been here as legacy since 1984. During that time, we were very supported by Tony Hillerman, and we are very excited to have James McGrath Morris and Ann Hillerman in conversation about Ann's father, Tony Hillerman. Ann has taken on the Leap Horn and Chi novels that Tony started, and she wrote this fantastic book on Tony Hillerman's landscapes. Her newest book is Stargazer, which you should buy and read again and again. And James McGrath Morris is the author of The Ambulance Driver, about Dos Passos and Hemingway. He also wrote the biography of Pulitzer and The Eye on the Struggle about Ethel Payne, and just a phenomenal person to be taking on Tony Hillerman's biography. And I will turn it over to you and keep an eye on the people coming in and the chat. If you have questions, if you'd like to put it in the chat or during Q&A, you can raise your hand and I'll do my best to keep an eye on that. Welcome everybody from New York, from Canada, from Virginia. We welcome you. And if you just want to give James and Ann a welcome, thank you so much for being here. And Ann and James, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. As you mentioned, my dad really did love Bookworks. That was one of his very favorite places in all of Albuquerque. And my mom loved it too. And after my dad died, my mom made up for my dad not being there by buying twice as many books. So thank you for the opportunity that you've given me tonight to talk with my friend and wonderful biographer, James McGrath Morris. When Jamie first talked to me about writing the biography of Dad, I wondered what there was that he could say or do that my father had not covered in his own memoir, Seldom Disappointed. And so I think Jamie will probably talk about that, but I wanted to ask you, first of all of the people you could have written about, why did you pick Tony Hillerman? I mean, there's so many interesting people in New Mexico, in the Southwest, etc. What was it about Tony that you thought you'd want to spend 2 years doing his story?
Well, being a biographer is a little bit like dating. And when Tony went into that dance at University of Oklahoma and saw Marie, he was swept away. And that's in some ways what happens to me. You know, if you're going to spend 3 years with somebody, biography is really all absorbing. I mean, you think about the figure and you shower, you go to bed thinking about it, you have little note cards by your bedside table in the middle of the night, you write down an idea. You're going to travel to places. It's not bad work. I mean, I love the work, but it's so all-encompassing. It has to be somebody who wants to live with. Patty, my wife, described this field as living in a menage a trois, in that you have the husband and wife, and then you got this other presence. So that's one of the reasons. But the more serious reason is that I've been convinced for a decade that he needed a biography because I think he's underappreciated, his significance as a literary figure. Not that he doesn't have fans, don't get me wrong. By the word underappreciated, what I mean is that I don't think the world has recognized what a significantly important thing he did. And a book like this, with this many pages, tends to help people place them in the cast of characters of literature. And the reason I think that is there are two things that I think go on in his work. The first is his creation of Joe Leap Horn, which we can talk about in a little while, how purposeful it was, but the creation of 18 novels set on the Navajo Nation, with two of the leading figures being Navajos, in a world of a genre have been dominated by white men and the tough private eye in LA versus, and then maybe some women in some small villages in England.
The Raymond Chandler,
yeah,
Agatha Christie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about somebody else who did something like your dad did, but your dad really is the person that broke that barrier with these books. And then secondly, he did this remarkable thing. The world knows a lot about the Navajo Nation, Navajo spirituality and culture, because it's not just the backdrops of his novels. He wove it into the novels himself in a very respectful manner. And so it's hard not to read one of these books and suddenly become deeply informed about the features of Navajo life that are so interesting for the world outside, which would have no opportunity to get it. So Tony was this figure that he called himself at one point, or your dad called himself a reverse missionary, in the sense of bringing out all of these things. And it shouldn't be discounted. We haven't talked about this before, but the Navajo Nation, when it looks at how it's treated in the outside world, they get newspaper reporters who come when there's a plague break out. They get newspaper reporters who come when there's corruption. They get newspaper reporters come when there's poverty, when the coal plants are shut. Very rarely do they get something like your dad's books, where they see themselves represented in a fair and honest manner that celebrates their culture and does that. And I know one Navajo woman whose family ran a grocery store at a very important intersection near Venado. And she had a Hillerman book. She was a teenager. And she came bursting out of her bedroom to her sisters and said, "Look, our gas station is in this book."
Yeah.
And that's a bigger sense. Their lives were represented in this book. And so for many young Navajos in the 70s and 80s, even in the 90s, they learned a lot about their own culture, not just things they didn't know, because they obviously knew a lot, but they saw their culture being portrayed in a celebratory manner. And that's fundamentally different.
Well, I know one thing that made Dad really proud was when he learned that they were teaching his books in high schools and junior highs on the Navajo Nation.
And I met some of those teachers, and for some of them, it was the book that broke through. You know how I taught for 10 years, and your dad taught too. You know that finding something gets a kid interested in learning is really hard. And your dad's books certainly played a role in getting kids engaged in reading. Yeah. And it was true at some of the boarding schools too.
Well, you know, and you probably know this better than anyone, Dad got a lot of awards, but of all the awards he got, the one that he was really most proud of was when he was named a Friend of the Navajo Nation.
That was an extraordinary award.
Yeah. And I think the other things that really made him happy were if he would get an invitation, say from a high school in Ganado or Shiprock or Window Rock, to come and talk to the kids.
Yeah. He got an invitation from the Zuni Pueblo at Dance Hall of the Dead, because then you know the novel was set
Indeed,
there.
he did. Yeah.
And he was the commencement speaker. And I was delighted to learn that a friend of mine turned out to have been in that class. So,
oh my goodness.
we connected lots of dots.
Why don't you tell that story? That's a lovely story about what happened after he gave that commencement speech.
Yeah. Well,
maybe you should give a little bit of background about Dance Hall of the Dead for people who might have forgotten that book.
Sure. Dance Hall of the Dead is his third novel, but his second Navajo novel. His first Navajo novel, which we should talk about at some point, Blessing Way, because it's so significant, was followed by The Fly on the Wall, which is a sort of political reporting intrigue book set in a state capital in the Midwest. Dance Hall of the Dead comes next. And I argue that really, when people say to me, what of your dad's books should I start with? I always say they should start with Dance Hall of the Dead. First of all, it's a very early novel, but it's the one where Leaphorn is the protagonist, the most important figure in the book. And also it has this incredible cleverness, because you have Leaphorn as a Navajo investigating crime that's mostly on the Zuni Pueblo. So you're learning about Navajo spirituality and culture, and you're going through his eyes to learn about the Zuni culture. And so he's always making these comparisons. You do that, well, we do this, and do that. It's just magnificently clever. And it also really fleshes out Leaphorn's personality and things like that. So he was invited to speak at the commencement high school, Zuni High School. He'd also published through Harper a children's book about the dragonfly.
Right, the boy who made Dragonfly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting episode, because he did it in 1971, 72, early on, maybe 73, but the point is that he took a very traditional and important story of the Zuni population and modernized the English and made it much more readable for non-Zunis. And so there was some feeling, that little minor tension about this when he went out to the Zuni Pueblo. And then he published Dance Hall of the Dead, which had all this stuff about their ceremonies and the winter one and all those things. So he gave this talk, and it's a really interesting talk I represent in the book. But afterwards, he was summoned, not asked, he was summoned to the principal's office, which is terribly symbolic when you think about it. They didn't just summon him to a conference, and there were elders there. And they wanted to know where the heck he'd gotten all this information for Dance Hall of the Dead, because they were worried that there was information that shouldn't have been provided him. And he spoke about all the publicly available sources he had, and they said, oh, well, that's okay. I went out to do research in the Zuni Pueblo about 4 years ago. So what's that, almost 40 years later. And the book is actually very popular. I always had these preconceptions that, you know, things that are written like this wouldn't end, and many of the Zunis I met remember the book well. So.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. When Don Strell and I were working on Tony Hillerman's landscape, we wanted to include photos of Zuni, and we talked to the Zuni Tribal Council, and they kept saying, oh, well, we'll let you know. And we had a feeling that it was never going to happen. And then we have a friend who's a Zuni, and he called us one day and he said, I think this might be a good time for you to talk to the Tribal Council. So it turned out that the governor of Zuni, they had a new governor, and he had gone to school at, I think it was University of Utah. And he said he was so desperately homesick. He didn't think he could make it through, even through the semester. So he was at the student union trying to build up his courage to call home, to say to his mom and dad, sorry, this isn't going to work. And in the student union, they had a copy of Dance Hall of the Dead. And he said he saw the war god on the cover, the artist's conception of the Zuni war god. And he thought, this is a sign to me that I need to call on my own inner warrior and tough it out here. So he read the book, and he said that really got him through that hard time. And I was really touched by that story.
Well, you know, it's replicated in lots of ways that you may not know, in that your dad kept files of his correspondence, of course. And there's several young Navajos that corresponded with him, and they would be, and suddenly you get a letter from the military. Dear Tony, or often Mr. Hillman, but a lot of it says, Dear Tony, I'm now stationed overseas, and here's what I'm doing. And he carried on correspondence with us, even very late, because one of the things that happened to Anne's dad is when the books became successful, mail poured in just enormous quantities, and it wasn't email at first. So of course it didn't exist. So you'd have to put a piece of paper in a typewriter, type it, find a stamp. It was all that, and it was overwhelming. My favorite thing about your dad's fame was he had a regular, this audience is probably very young, so they don't know anything about unlisted phone numbers and home phones. But anyway, the home phone would ring, and once he'd had, I don't know, 6 or 7 calls that day from people who called up, and somebody called up and said, I'm thinking of going out to New Mexico and visiting the Navajo Nation. You have an Isuzu. Where do you get your Isuzu serviced? And he hung up after that and talked to your mother, Marie, and said, we need an unlisted number.
Yeah, I remember that story. Yeah.
And that, you know, it's a very hard thing to do, because one of the characteristics of your dad that's so admirable is, I say that he never stepped on anybody in his rise through literature to become so successful that he was. He never took advantage of anybody. But the reverse is also true. Well, not the reverse, the corollary is true, is that as he became successful, he never ceased to give a hand to other writers. He was always willing to borrow books. He was always willing to read something. And at one point, and I think you may have been the one who told me this comment that he made once, that writing got hard when he was so busy being a writer, you know, fulfilling all the other things, conferences, right, speaking, and all of those kinds of things. But he loved his public. And the other sweet story that actually is on the cutting room, so this isn't in the book if you go looking for it, is I interviewed a waitress at a restaurant in Albuquerque, or she'd been a waitress, she no longer was, and she saw your dad and mother come in for dinner one night. So she went up to him as he was coming down the stairs and said, Mr. Hillerman, I'm just so thrilled to hear it. I'm just this enormous fan of your work. And as soon as there was a pause in her conversation, he turned and said, have you met my wife, Marie? Yeah. And that was so much of his characteristic. And, you know, it's interesting you said, Anne, that your mother bought a lot of books at Bookworks. One of the treasures you have in your files are these notebooks your mother kept. And I was unaware of this. Anne's mother, Marie, was extraordinarily private. And I don't want to call it shy, but private's a better word.
Let me just interrupt you for
Yeah.
1 second. One of my big disagreements with Dad's memoir is that my mom is hardly in it.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, they were married for, I guess they'd been married probably 40 years at that time. And I don't think, I'm almost positive Dad would not have had the career he had without my mom's
No, he
help
wouldn't.
and support. And so, but because she was so private, she did not want any mention. I mean, really, the readers were lucky that he let her use it. He let her use his name. It was like, whoa. So I was really happy that you gave her a little more, you gave her more credit. in
She's
this one.
very important. I mean, look,
Yeah.
you have the, she gave up the possibility of an extraordinary important professional career. She's
Yeah.
a trained biologist and could have gone on to do all kinds of things. And then she had the courage to move to Borger, Texas, which is hardly, and please, if you're Texans, I'm not making fun of your state, but Borger is not the center of the universe. And she moved there to live in basically a converted garage while Tony worked at the Borger News Herald. And then they hardly settled there and decorated. Off they went to Lawton, where Anne was born. And then from Lawton, they went to Oklahoma City. So I forget the count. You know, when you write a book, and you tend to forget the specifics because you've written it 3 or 4 years ago. But at one point, they bought and moved four or five times in 5 different places. I mean, in a matter of a few
Yeah,
years.
Yeah.
And that's not
I'm sure
easy.
that's right.
And then I've
Yeah.
heard that you were a very pleasant child, but still, as a little child, dragging you along.
Wish I was the perfect child,
I'm
but
sure you
even
were.
then, you know.
But so that she provided that support, but she also provided the support at the crucial moment when your dad decided to make the leap, to leave a really secure job running in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to go to UNM, get a graduate degree, and pursue a writing career.
Yeah.
And the number of people who've done that have succeeded is, you know, the odds aren't there. And Marie
Yeah.
never hesitated.
Well, I remember that very well. And I remember my mom saying, don't worry about money. I can get a job. And I mean, she already had a job raising us 5 kids. So, and she said, if you don't do this now, chances are you will never do it. And I know you need to be a writer. I know that's what you're meant to do in this world. And, you know, not many people would be that brave.
But she could also have been somebody who said, if you're meant to be a cowboy or a skydiver, you could have done it. But the thing that she possessed also is a really keen understanding of writing and books. And that's where these notebooks of yours were so valuable. She kept these, what, about 3 by 5 little,
Yeah.
of course, one of the hallmarks of
About-
Marie is,
About the size of
Oh, you
this,
have one
maybe
too.
smaller. Yeah.
they were very careful about their money, even when they did very well. So she bought these little notebooks at the drugstore, and she would write what book she had read and a really pithy, tiny review of it, maybe 3 or 4 lines.
Mhm.
But if you looked through the book and found books that you had read, myself had read, and then I compared them to the comments, they were really keen understanding of the books.
Yeah.
So when they would, you know, one of the things your dad would do, and I suspect you do the same, when the writing didn't go well, they would just get in the car and head out to the Navajo Nation. Well, I'm sure the conversations were often about the books, and I bet you anything that her comments were really astute based on that. So yeah, I think I'm hopeful that more people will recognize Marie's important role in his career in this book.
Yeah. So what was the biggest challenge for you in doing this biography?
Biggest challenge, there's so many different ones. There are areas of his life that I had to piece together that there's not enough records. So sometimes it's you know, you're building on 3 or 4 facts. You know, he got there, and one of the letters it says something, you know, he saw so and so. So there are a few areas early in his life that were hard to piece together. So the chapter about when he's in Lawton and going to Oklahoma, I had less material to work with.
Mhm.
But your dad was really good at keeping material. So the rest of the book, I had no trouble fleshing it out.
Once they got to New Mexico,
Oh,
did your
yeah.
job get
Oh,
easier?
yeah. Oh, much easier. The challenge as a writer is that I didn't want to give anything away. I didn't, you know, I have an account of how these books were written, but I can't tell the reader how he solved the problem, because if I tell the reader that, then they're not going to pick up one of your dad's books. So this is a book without spoilers. And that was a real writing challenge. And at one point, my editors wrote me a note saying, I think you ought to read page so and so of the manuscript. And she was right. given too much of a big hint about something. I don't remember which novel it was. So that was certainly a challenge. The lucky thing for me is that your dad and I are very different. I mean, I grew up partly overseas in the East Coast. I went to private schools. Your dad grew up in a very small town in Oklahoma with a struggling family. Dad died an early death. College wasn't going to be an option had it not been for the GI Bill. So at first glance, your dad and I are very different. But there are a couple of things that unite us. One, when you've been a journalist, there's an instant fraternity with other journalists. I knew exactly what was going through his mind when he was working as a reporter, because I'd done that.
Yeah.
The other thing is we're both Anglo immigrants to New Mexico, and we both fell in love with New Mexico, obviously different times. I came in the 70s and he came in the 50s. So I could tell the emotions that he felt because I felt them. Whereas if I was writing about a book from, we mentioned Nebraska, which was, you're going to be appearing in Nebraska. You should tell people
Right.
that. Yeah, you're going to be in Kearney.
Yeah.
Next week, no, 2 days from now.
2 days from now, I'm their community reads author. I'm going to talk about my book Stargazer, and then and I'm going to mostly talk though about public libraries and why they are so crucial to our society on so many levels. And then I'm going to do a writing workshop talking about setting and characters. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I've never been to
You can see
Nebraska.
the
I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Hillerman genes at work here, because your dad was always willing to do that. Right up to when he was very weak, he was always willing to go out and talk.
He was. One of his last talks, he went down to New Mexico State University. And I remember someone from NMSU drove all the way to Albuquerque to pick him up and drove him down there. And there were lots and lots of people. It was a long day, and Dad was really, I mean, he was tired before he even left. And then she drove him home. And I thought, my goodness, what a wonderful gift that was.
Well, he gave them a gift. I'm going to be speaking in Farmington in December at the public library there.
Oh.
And I'm bringing with me a cassette recording of your dad having spoken there in the early 80s.
Oh.
So I'm going to play a little excerpt in the talk.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. I'm going to do a talk in Bloomfield.
Yeah.
Yeah, in November. Yeah. Well, you talked about the challenge. What was the biggest, what made you smile the most? What was the biggest joy? What was the biggest pleasure that you had in putting this book together?
The biggest pleasure is similar to your dad's and yours when it works. When you finally set up a chapter where you think that people are not there, it's late at night, the book is out, and they're reading the book, and it's 11 o'clock at night, and they're getting tired to get to the end of the chapter, and they say, "I got to read another chapter because I leave at this point." Well, we as writers often can see that as we're working for it. And when your dad would rewrite it, a lot of his manuscripts are available for us. And in fact, I should add that shortly, I'm going to be doing a lecture at the University of New Mexico's library called the Willard Lecture on the 11th of November. And in conjunction with that, we're putting up about a 10-item display on the web, which includes a page or two from your dad's manuscripts, as well as a page from some of his papers that he wrote at college. But the point is that you can see a manuscript where he's taken a pen or a pencil and crossed out something because it didn't work. So one of the pleasures I had is seeing the novels develop. As opposed to the finished novel. And then one of the great things is your dad's novels, like yours, are digitized. So I could have the manuscript there and the Kindle version there and do a quick search to see if that person still existed in the novel. And very often he'd wipe the person out, or change the name. And
sometimes you have to do that.
Yeah. Well, changing the name, that was an exciting one for me, which was that Tony got frustrated with Leaphorn as a character. And that's in part because when he created him somewhat accidentally. Accidental may not be the right word, but he wasn't going to be the center of the first book, so he hadn't thought it all through. But he was saddled with him. So book 2 and book 3 with Leaphorn. At that point, he decided he needed to create somebody differently. And he'd already started on the next manuscript. And in the manuscript, you can find him going in with a pencil, changing Leaphorn's name to Jim Chee. He tried several different names, but you can see. And so you can just imagine his feeling, like, oh, that does work. And then he'd go and change the manuscript. So the birth of Chee is actually a literal moment, and there'll be a page up on the exhibit where you can see Leaphorn's name being crossed out.
That's interesting. Didn't some of that also have to do with a movie deal God
Yeah.
had? Yeah, I love that story.
Well,
Why'd you-
actually, one of the things Tony and I have in common is we were both represented by the same literary agent at one point.
Uh-oh.
His first agent was Anne Elmo, who was a very well-known literary agent in New York that he had been introduced to by Morris Friedman, the professor that was so influential on your dad at UNM. And she negotiated, well, I don't know if negotiated is the right word, she arranged a movie deal in which she gave up the rights to Leaphorn as a character. And there was a lot of dispute as to whether that meant he could no longer write about him. I think most lawyers would have said, don't worry about it, you've given up the movie rights, but not the rights. But he did end up having to write a check for $20,000 to get the rights back when the movies were being made by Robert Redford to clear the air.
He called it buying Leaphorn out of slavery or something.
But so I think your dad was overly concerned, but of course he had 3 Chi books, and then he brings them together again.
So actually, I think for Hillerman readers, it worked out well.
He did.
It's sort of like Leaphorn was set aside. He had the opportunity to develop this new character who was very different than Joe Leaphorn.
But he
And then
did,
I
there's
love
that-
that. I love that story
There
that
was
you
a
have in
reader.
there. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, your dad goes to a book signing, and this woman, I wish I had the book open to remember exactly what she said, but she basically said she couldn't see the difference between Leaphorn and
She asked him, why did you change the name of your character?
Oh yeah, as opposed to a whole new character.
Yeah.
So your dad thought putting them together, maybe people would get it. These are 2 different folks, not the name of the character changed.
And actually that then led to the breakthrough books that put him on.
Skinwalkers and then
Yeah.
Thief of Time.
Right.
Your dad had a charming innocence and a journalist's eye on the world, but there's certain parts of the world he had an innocence about, and understanding a little bit about New York publishing. I think at times he was a little bit of the kid from Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And so when his books began to do well, and they would say things like, you're going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. He said, well, I've been on a bestseller list before, and gave the book salesman who was with him, sat him down and gave him an explanation of how this would be fundamentally different, and it was.
Did it seem to you that success sort of caught him by surprise?
Yeah, I do. I never thought of that, but yeah, it did. He was 6, 7. It was 8 books in basically when that book began. He had the kind of success. The 2 kinds of successes you get as a writer. One, there are people who've come up to me who've read this book and say, I really like it. And my trick as an author is I always say, what did you like about it? And then they say something like, in chapter 3, you did such and such. And you realize you're getting a genuine compliment.
Oh, I'm going to steal your trick.
Oh.
I just say thanks.
It's so worthwhile because
Good
you
idea.
then realize
Yeah.
Writing is such a solitary task. Your dad would go back into the bedroom and type away, and then you come out and play Spider Solitaire and go, oh, that's the idea, and go back. And there's nobody around you. It's a very solitary thing. But at some point, just like an orchestra has to have an audience, a writer has to have a reader. And if you've known you've connected to a reader, that's deeply satisfying. And your dad demonstrated that in all the books when they began to sell more and more. He was more excited by the letters he got and the readers he got than the money.
Yeah.
Now, granted, the money was terribly important. I mean, you had 5 siblings, a college salary, which wasn't a great amount, so it made a big difference. But the difference between Skinwalker took off and then Thief of Time just blasted out. That's the moment when your dad, I think, said, "Oh my goodness!" And when the checks came in, I know he shared one with you. I think it was a really changing moment for him. But
it was.
the character of your dad, and this is why I think it's so important, both your dad and Marie, 2 different schools, miles apart, one in Shawnee and one in Sacred Heart. They were taught by Sisters of Mercy, which is a very unusual, well, I should say unusual, but a really extraordinarily interesting order of nuns. And they had this vow of service, and it certainly was inculcated in these kids. So when your dad became very successful financially, he never changed. I mean, he really did. Now, there are a lot of famous people you hear about that say, you hear, oh, they didn't change, but they do. But your dad took years before he bought a decent car. They went to BJ's in Albuquerque with the coupons and went
Yeah.
for the early sitting when they could have
Yeah.
probably bought the restaurant, out that night with cash. I mean,
Yeah, JB's, it was
JB's, sorry.
JB's, and they
Yeah.
got this like neighborhood newspaper, and the coupon, honest to goodness, was like this little, and my mom would cut it out and have it in her wallet, save 10%.
One of my favorite finds of being careful with money is your dad typed one of the early drafts of Blessing Way on the backside of UNM stationery that was out of date because it said celebrating the 50th anniversary or something. So he stacks of it, and the whole manuscript, if you flip it over, it says, University of New Mexico President's Office and all of that. So he was very, very careful in that respect.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question. Is your dad present with you when you're late at night writing?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it's when things are going well, I feel like he is. And sometimes when things are not going so well, I wish he were, because I would like to ask him, how would you solve this problem? In Stargazer, I was about 75% through with the book when I realized that I had the wrong villain. And I was lucky because that was my sixth book. So I thought, I can figure this out somehow. But I was wishing, at that point, I was wishing that Dad had been around so I could have said, so what shall I do with these 200 and something pages that are all building up to the acknowledgement that this guy is the villain? But I think he did send me some help, because it dawned on me that if the true villain had fooled me, maybe that true villain would also fool the reader. So I was able to do a little fiddling here and there, and
it worked.
Well, I hope it worked.
Oh, it did. I read the book. It worked. No
Thanks.
question about it. One of the hallmarks of your dad's work is the use of landscape. And I describe it as a used landscape, as a character in his books, the way people interact with them. It's not a backdrop like when you go to the Santa Fe Opera, they have a backdrop. This is fundamental. How have you done that? And have you at times turned your dad's books, or did you have your own ideas? How does landscape work in your book?
One idea, when I decided that I would see if I could continue the series, one idea I had was to introduce people to other places on the reservation that Dad had not written about, because there are so many wonderful sites, and so many sites that really have enormous significance in the Navajo culture and to the Navajo people. So in Spider Woman's Daughter, one of those settings was at Chaco Canyon. And Dad used Chaco Canyon in Thief of Time, but he really only uses the public housing for the staff. He never actually takes the readers into the ruins. So I had a lot of fun having Bernie and Chi spend the night in the campground and see elk, and having hiding a body there where there were, maybe had been bodies or maybe had not been bodies. Anyway, yeah, I think I followed that same tradition, because it just seems to me that landscape, and particularly when you live in a place where we do, where there's so much landscape. And then when you look at the Navajo Nation, where there's even that, times 10 or 20.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I share this with audiences. I'm going to read a little quote that applies to landscape. So I just love, when I started this book 3 or 4 years ago, I met a writer, Frank Clifford, who worked at the LA Times. And he told me something, he emailed me and said something about Hillerman that I think is just wonderful, and I want to share with you. Hillerman, he said, did for Navajo country what Raymond Chandler did for LA, putting it onto the map we carry around in our imaginations that never becomes obsolete. And one of my jobs in life is I've been a Rhodes Scholar tour leader, as you have at one point. And these are people who come out here and to go on these programs and see the Navajo Nation and other places. And we always polled them, and it turned out at least a third of the audience in the back of the bus had come here because of your dad's books. And they were drawn here because of the physicality, not because of the plot. They wanted to see that landscape.
Right.
And your book, of course, represents that, the lovely book you did.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of photo books, talk about the book that my dad and my Uncle Barney did.
That's right. There were 3 children, and I always pause because your oldest aunt takes me a second. To Margaret Mary, I always want to reverse it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Barney, and Tony was the youngest. And Barney and Tony were very, very deep friends, aside from being brothers. And they did a lot of hijinks in the University of Oklahoma when they attended on the GI Bill. You'll read a story of a little bit of scandal when Tony, who was running the humor magazine, and Barney go to Oklahoma City to do a review of a strip joint. And the language is filled with double entendres, and Barney took the picture. So you can see the two of them were getting into mischief. Barney became successful in the sense that he became a really good photographer. It was a struggle financially. He'd given up working as a geologist to do this. And he had taken wonderful pictures of the Southwest, and he and your dad worked together in creating a book of photographs with your dad's text. Your dad's text is wonderful, and it just goes so well with photographs. One of these oversized books. Sadly, Anne's uncle Barney passed away just before the book came out, within a few days. Next week, Anne and I will be appearing at the Silver City Southwest Word Fiesta. And one of the things I'll be doing is I'm putting together a slideshow of those photographs, which will be available online. And it'll be shown for the first time there during the festival. And I'm sure we'll keep it up for people to see.
Great.
It's just it's a wonderful symbol of good brotherhood.
I have to say, though, it didn't work out so well for me and for Don and me when we were doing our Hillerman landscape book. Because when we came up with the idea for that book, I envisioned that Dad would be driving with us all through the Navajo Nation, and we'd go to all these places, and he would have these wonderful memories, and it would be like, one of those wonderful father-daughter bonding experiences. So I said to Dad, we're going to do this book. What do you think? He said, oh, I think it's a great idea. I said, we'd love it if you would come with us. He said, oh, I think you can just get those pictures on computer. And I tried to persuade him, and he said, well, I went with Barney, and I remember sitting in the car waiting for the light to change. And we're sitting in the car waiting for the light to change. He said, he said, at this point, I really like my afternoon naps. So just show me on your computer.
But it's so funny that Dad mentions computers, because he had such a relationship with computers. I mean,
not even a love hate.
No,
no love. There was no love.
He was losing files all the time. Jim Belshaw would come over, his dear friend, to try to figure out. I guess it was your brother Tony helped a lot. The save
key, what he could have. That made so much sense to me, but he just never. I think because he got so wrapped up in the process, exactly. And the technology was not important to him, and then he would just turn it off when he was done.
One of the interesting things about technology and shaping your dad's writing is when he was UP United Press, which we now call UPI, changed its name later. He was a UP reporter, Capital correspondent in Oklahoma City, and one of the things he did is he typed stories right onto the teletype. It's live. So if he typed Governor Smith today, it was going down the pike, so to speak, to the newspapers. Mm-hmm. So if you know anything about writing, that's really a high wire act, because you might need to introduce something you forgot to introduce, or where you're going to put the adjective and all of that. So that constant typing in that fashion made it really gave him that kind of discipline to be able to go into the bedroom and churn out those pages, because most writers know that really the key to writing is to vomit that first version, just get it out there, because it's the reworking that makes it so good.
Right.
And your dad loved reworking his works, except he didn't like the picky stuff. He was not good at copy editing material, but he would see the problems. And in fact, one of the books, the one that goes to Washington, Sacred Clowns, is that the one?
Talking God.
Talking God, yeah. The review copies have a different ending than the books that went out, because he looked at it and said, I don't like it. And Harper said, well, we already sent the review copies out. It doesn't matter. Your dad was humble. He never said that, but hint, I make you guys a lot of money. You're going to fix the book.
Well, and it's my book.
Yeah,
you are publishing it, but this is my reputation here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is your writing process? Do you do a lot of revision?
Yeah, that's most of what I do. I write, when I start a book, when I started your dad's biography, I wrote 1% of the time and researched 99% of the time. Then soon I would be writing 2% of the time, researching 98% of the time. And that equation would continue to change, or ratio would continue to change. one of the reasons it's important to be writing while you're researching is you don't know what the question is. You don't know what the story is. It's the trying to tell the story that you realize the elements you need. So if I'd done all this research about Oklahoma University before I wrote the chapter, I wouldn't have known what buildings were important. I didn't know, did he have classes in that building and that kind of thing. So it's a combination, and then you find the material to fill it out. So let's say your figure is having lunch with 3 people, and you know that, and you've typed it in your notes, and you come to that chapter. Maybe a year later, and you suddenly realize one of those people at the lunch is really important. Then you do the research to flesh out the character. So I write all the time, and then the other thing I like to do is to let the stuff sit long enough so it looks completely different to me. If you rewrite something you wrote yesterday, it's too familiar. Put chapter 1 away. You get back to it 6 months later. You go, huh. Sometimes you get the wonderful sense, that's not bad. I like that sentence. Who wrote it? But more often than not, you think, oh, this is going on too long. This is boring. And I know you do the same thing.
Right.
You want to cut out the part that the readers don't want to read.
Right.
That's
And it's funny how sometimes you can't see that part until you've let it sit for a while. And it's also always amazes me. I have, and I'm sure you do too, what I call beta readers, people, good friends who will tell you the truth if something really stinks. And they'll read it and they'll give me comments. And then my editor will read it and she'll give me comments. And then often when I'm looking at the corrections, I see all kinds of things that are just, I don't know, flat-footed, inappropriate, boring, whatever, just.
Well, your dad
it makes me understand how people can spend 30 years writing a book.
Yeah.
Because that part of your brain that says, oh, you can do better, just.
You have, at some point,
you have to say, yeah, but let's just say that for the next book.
Your dad was also remarkable because of his objection to using outlines. He tried several times. And in fact, if you're interested, there's an article he wrote for Writers Magazine about not using the blueprint. Because every time he tried to use an outline, it didn't work, and he liked having his characters evolve naturally. But to do that, you have to be able to go back to the beginning. So in, I don't know, it's People of Darkness, one of them where he has that dog, where he didn't have the dog in the beginning of the book, and he realizes he needs a dog. So he goes back to bring with the dog.
Anyway,
that's exactly right. Sorry, 18, Dad wrote 18 of these things.
You're doing very well.
I remember the passage, but I can't always remember, which of these books? And then he did People of Darkness and Dark Winds, too close to each other with the dark name and title, and that gets really confusing. But the point is that I had the privilege of seeing these manuscripts grow organically because I was going through the manuscripts, and I know how the book was going to turn out. And you could see that there's some problems in having an outline, because sometimes you have to work more to bring back things and do that foreshadowing and that sort of stuff. But the books really have this organic growth. Now, do you do that, or are you an outliner?
I think I got that gene, that organic growth gene. It was interesting after Dad died and my mom and I were trying to figure out what was in the filing cabinets that should go to the University of New Mexico. There was a whole big, maybe that big file folder that said first chapters. And they were first chapters they were wonderful first chapters, but in the end, they had nothing to do with the finished novel.
Oh yeah. There's one, he has a killer with this unusual name starting off in Miami. It made no sense, and he really had to rework that.
Yeah.
Your dad's papers are also charming because almost everything went into these boxes. And one of my favorites is one of the manuscripts. You turn the page, on the backside, he wrote, "Marie, Dan and I have gone out for a burger," which at that point in your dad's life, I know your mother was really concerned about his waist and going to Lottaburger.
Salad.
But that didn't go right. And also when your dad smoked, there are little burn marks on the manuscripts at times. So you can really see the personal life. So.
Yeah. So what do you do when you're not writing? Or are you, well, I guess you're always writing. But how do you take a break from it?
Oh, that's taking a break means doing something with my wife, going on a bicycle, running, or things like that. The problem is if I'm actually writing a book, I'm not always much fun, because let's say Patty and I just got to go for a walk. There's a moment where she might say, Jamie, because I'm thinking about something, and that's really unfair to your spouse. So you have to have space between the books, because otherwise.
That goes back to the menage a trois.
Yeah, exactly. And the third member is invading all the time.
Yeah.
So should we see if there are questions from the audience? Because I don't want to take up, I mean, there may be in my
Yeah.
classes.
I have more questions I can ask you.
Oh,
If the
sure.
audience has no questions.
Well, you could ask me a question while I see a lot of chats. Why, do you have questions that we should be answering?
You're muted. Why?
Oh, you want us to read? I think he's in.
Okay.
So let me find the chat box.
There it is.
Let's see, a certain age
How it
now.
will differ from seldom disappointed.
Oh, good question.
Very good question.
There are two things about it. Seldom Disappointed was a memoir, and a memoir is based on memory. So one of the features of it is that there's a tremendous emotional resonance in the book, because your dad can remember how scared he was in battle. He can remember how happy he was when he met your mother. He can remember the feeling of being in Miguel de Allende finishing a book. What he doesn't do is what a biographer does, which he has the wrong book he's finishing in the memoir. He has dates and events confused. I'm not trying to make fun of him. I'm just saying it's a memoir. So from a point of view of representing his life, he represents his emotional life perfectly, and I use it extensively. But the actual narration of his life is not there. Also, the book, and I counted it, 33% of the book is devoted to his war experience. So for me, that's terribly useful because it shows how important that was in shaping him. But at the same time, I had access to stuff he didn't. So I wanted to give people a bird's eye view of his work in the war, while he, using his memoir and his letters to his mother particularly, could give the ground view. And by combining the two, you get a much clearer view of what you experienced, the hellish experience he went through, and the almost fatal explosion. The explosion almost ended his life. So biography allows the third party to do this that a memoir doesn't. It also has, I also have distance from the subject, which he didn't. I mean,
Right, he was the subject.
He's, cutting open his vein and pouring it out on the page.
Right. And I'm sure, as we age, our memories,
Oh, yeah.
our memories change. And I think a lot of them, they are still emotionally true, but the facts get fuzzier and fuzzier.
And that's what I do as a biographer. If Tony were here, he would say exactly the same thing. There's an old adage among journalists that as soon as you get your first job, your editor says, be questioning, be skeptical of anything you say. In fact, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Your dad would have done the same thing approaching his own life if he was writing it as a biography. But what he did do is provide the emotional memory, which is true no matter what. And that allowed me to convey how he felt at a particular moment. He may have had the wrong moment, but I had the emotion, and I just need to fill in the details.
You've captured a lot of Dad's humor too. Which
I was worried about it.
I really appreciate.
In fact, one of the things I make the point in the book that I urge people to go and read The Great Taoist Bank Robbery. It's not just good, it is great. And it represents a piece of work that if Mark Twain were around, you'd be jealous of it. It's so sensational. And it's a real treat to have an audible version of it, because it's so much like your dad's first introduction to storytelling, which would have been Sacred Heart, people sitting on the porch, rocking back and telling stories. And if you look at the cadence, the way the Taoist story is told, it's a porch story. It's a perfect model.
It is. And I have to say, I was glad that University of Oklahoma decided to publish your book. I think it just gives it a lot of weight. And when you mentioned The Great Taoist Bank Robbery, University of New Mexico Press put out a new edition of that.
Yeah.
The original edition had these wonderful illustrations by an artist named Dan Stouffer. Probably Albuquerque people know him. He's been around forever. Great work. But when they did the new edition, they asked Don and me if I would ask me to do an introduction and Don to do photos. So we went to a lot of the places that Dad wrote about it. I was really so happy that you and Impress didn't want that book to just kind of fade into the background, that they loved it enough that they kept it alive.
And the connection, the story is very emblematic of Dad's career, because it's a story that came out of his experience running the Santa Fe New Mexican. And it came to be because Morris Friedman constructed the idea of writing a thesis that would comprise small sellable stories, knowing that your dad needed money, as opposed to writing a thesis on iambic pentameter of some poem or some,
Right.
never heard before poet.
Right.
So Morris
right.
Friedman really pushed him to do that and forced your dad to break those constraints of journalism and be much more creative.
Yeah.
So it's not only a charming piece and the other book pieces in that book,
Yeah.
but it represents a really key moment in your dad's life.
Yeah, that's really true. I see that we have a question
Good.
about
I'm glad you
movies.
can read them. Oh,
Yeah. The movies that there's a series of movies being made for AMC. They're TV episodes, not movies. I think they're starting with 6 of them.
Mhm.
They're based on Joe Leaphorn in the 1970s, all native cast and all native, the guys who need to be native are native and the women, and native script writers, and the Navajo Nation has given them permission to film on the nation. So I'm hoping that it'll be wonderful. I think taking Joe Leaphorn back to the 70s was an
That's a
interesting
really great
idea. Robert Redford and George R.R. Martin are the guys with the money behind it. They were filming it in Santa Fe, and I'm not sure where they are now. The idea, I think, is that it's supposed to be out next spring.
Mhm.
So stay tuned.
That's
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm really excited about it. I think it'll call, again, new attention to Dad's work. I hope attention to Jamie's wonderful new book, and maybe even attention to my continuation of the series.
Yeah, it should. I mean, visual readers, it's much like Longmire's series that Craig Johnson did.
Yeah.
There was a previous experience, which you'll read about in my book, when Robert Redford's first bite of the apple. Redford had made the Milagro Beanfield Wars and read some of Tony's books and said, this is movie material, and bought the rights. And around 1999, 2000, 2001, 2003, there were several that were on PBS's Masterpiece Theater. And there are parts of it that don't work. And there's very, very rarely in life does somebody get 2 chances at something. So Redford's motivation this time is really interesting because he's back at it. He still has the same belief he had 25 years ago. And he's keenly aware of what didn't work in the first set.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a magnificent series.
Oh, you should tell the story, the poker story.
Oh, yeah.
I love that story.
When Redford, your dad had a poker game that he gathered at, and I'll get the picture out. We can try a Zoom thing. Let's see if we can see this. Let's see. I got to go this way and see if the audience can see the picture. It's out of focus.
It's
right over
right
here.
over here.
Yeah. Well, that's the poker table. And I don't want to be sacrilegious, but it was religious to go to this poker game.
It was.
And
Tuesday night, nothing could get in the way.
Nothing could get in the way. And I have various accounts of how your dad played poker. One, it turned out to be an apocryphal story, but I still love it. It's not in the book. He said he got so interested in a story that he lowered his hand so people would see the cards. But it turns out your dad was not that type. He was very competitive. But the real reason was to talk. And all of the people around the table were veterans. They all understood what it had been like to be at war. And so it was a very important game. And Robert Redford came to town and wanted to take your dad out for a meal. And said,
to talk about the movie
we
stuff.
talk about the movie. And he said, Tuesday, well, I can't. I got a poker game. And nobody could believe that Tony Hillerman had turned down dinner with Robert Redford because of a poker game. But on Redford's side of the story, he said he understood that because he knew there were things important in life. But the players at the table certainly didn't.
Well, the older ones did.
Yeah, the older ones.
The ones who were of Dad's generation, sure.
And people would ask him, actually, it's interesting this comes up, people would ask him at book signings once the story is told, Mr. Hillerman, is it really true you turned down dinner with Robert Redford? I mean, he did have dinner with him on a different night,
Yeah.
but so that story lives on and on. One story, give away one little nugget. You remember my business of being skeptical about things. Well, when I first started this project, there was a famous story that the agent that Tony had, Ann Elmo, when she got Blessing Way, says, it's good, but you got to get rid of that Indian stuff. And Joan Kahn, the editor at HarperCollins, who so appreciated his work, had the opposite idea that more of it should be put in. I thought this is just too perfect a story. Well, actually, it turns out to be very true. And I tell the true version in the story with the documents that I found. So sometimes these stories that, emerge from somebody famous aren't true. That one is very true. So I can't read these things. So do we have other questions we should be answering?
Oh, talking about the TV stuff, says, I'm glad as I found the original movies disappointing as compared to your father's works.
Yeah.
I have to say, Dad, he was very, I don't know quite what the word is. He understood the difference between books and movies. And I think, it's so much in his stories happens when you have one guy driving in a car for a long time.
Yeah.
And obviously that doesn't make a very good movie. So I think he understood that there would need to be some changes. The one that bothered him the most was Thief of Time, because of the way that they sort of sexualized one of the workers at Chaco Canyon, and she's flirting with Joe Leaphorn. And this is right after Joe's wife Emma has died. And that really bothered Dad, because he thought, no,
he
this would
expressed
not.
it. He told the
Yeah.
filmmakers he was not
Yeah,
happy with it.
yeah. But mostly he kind of let them be movies, and he thought if people like the movies, maybe they'll read the books and then they'll like the books even better.
One of the things about we started this conversation, which we're going to be ending in a couple of minutes, with a discussion of landscape. Jamie Redford, Robert Redford's son, wrote the script for the first one of these made-for-TV series. And he astutely, and that's why I opened up the book, I couldn't find it to get the exact quote, so I'm going to paraphrase it, but he wrote to your dad and said, one of the problems with making movies out of your books is your portrayal of the landscapes is so perfect, the words you use, and to translate that to film, it's not the same, it's very hard. And flip to that, there's another addition to that, is that our landscape, the Navajo landscape, has become cliched. I mean, how many car commercials have you seen with a car up on some butte in Monument Valley?
Sure.
So these poor filmmakers are facing making a movie out of somebody who wrote about landscapes in such a fashion that sometimes readers just have to reread the paragraph. It's so beautiful. To translate that into film with a stereotypical background is going to be very hard for them. So we'll wait to see.
Yeah. As a reader, I'm glad that Dad wrote about it so beautifully.
And you do too.
Well, thank you.
So I think we've come to the end of our time, Wyatt. Am I correct?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
Oh, okay. There's another.
We're not, yeah.
Okay, but you'll like get one of those hooks and pull us off. Okay.
Yeah, no, you're okay.
Can you check some of the chat questions, because I can't get them to all show up?
Yeah, there is something here mentioning that Adam Beach and Wes Studi were really good in the Hillerman movies, and asking why not use them in the new series. Good question. I don't know. I mean, and I have to say, basically, I saw an early script that I thought was pretty bad, and I sent my comments to the writers, and I mean, they're the pros. They know the native actors. So I'm just hoping that it'll all work out for the best. I agree with this comment. I thought Wes Studi was fine as Joe Leaphorn, even though he wasn't the way I'd ever pictured Joe Leaphorn. And I met Adam Beach. He was doing a movie in Santa Fe that had something to do with cowboys and space.
Oh, yeah. It was Cowboys and Martians or something.
Something. Anyway, and there were some women who were involved in that, and they invited me to come out to the big Four Seasons resort and have a drink with them. And Adam Beach was there, and he said, I'm sorry, I never had a chance to tell your dad how playing Jim Chi really was made a big change in my life. He said, he's a native guy from Canada. Yeah. And he said, I had kind of ignored all of that part of my heritage. He said that playing Jim Chi, who was so connected to his Navajo spiritual roots, really made me reconsider it. He said, and so, now I set up a foundation. It's like, and he was just, he wasn't telling me this so I could say, oh, aren't you so wonderful? He was telling it to me because he really wanted me to know that for him, it had been more than just a role in a movie. So
if you're a fan of trivial stuff about movies, Tony was an extra in one of the sets. It's very hard to find him. I had learned that he was in A Thief of Time in 2003. He had a cameo appearance, and I went through that movie pausing it all the time, and it's very brief. It's about 3 seconds in the revival tent, and you see him I have a picture of him in the book wearing the bandana, and the camera goes right by him for a second. He's in the front of the room. You know, it's, what was his name? Slick Jim or
Yeah, Slick Nakai.
Slick Nakai. So anyway,
Yeah.
so he was in one of the films.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, they had given him a bigger role. He had like a speaking role and he could never remember his lines.
Yeah, he came to appreciate how hard it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was in a suit inside one of the prisons, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah. One of our readers is reminding us that Zan McLaren,
Yes.
who played what the native sheriff, I think the Crow Sheriff in the Longmire series is playing Lee Porn.
Yeah.
I think he's going to do a great job. He certainly has the looks for that part. I mean, he doesn't look Navajo, but he certainly looks like he could be a sheriff.
No, it's funny listening to us two writers talking about a film. I'm really bad about it, but
Yeah,
it reminds me of those TV shows where they're talking about, oh, we're so excited about this film coming down the line, you know, those Entertainment Tonight.
Yeah.
And when people ask me these questions about movies, I'm so clueless because movies is not my beat.
I don't think we have to worry about being recruited by Entertainment Tonight.
No, I don't think so. Sorry.
So I wanted to ask you, what are you working on now?
I'm not.
You're not.
No.
You're taking a break.
Well, actually, I am doing one thing for myself. When I started this book, actually before I started this book, I wanted to know what it was like for your dad to go from writing journalism to writing fiction. So I started writing fiction, and I joined a writers group in Albuquerque. It's been going for years. And I got what you have, which I had no experience with, which is all of the stories you hear about writing fiction turn out to be true, where the spouse says to the person, so how is George behaving today, being a character? And I don't know, I haven't gotten to those pages yet. That something deep within you comes out. So I did that solely to understand what was going on with your dad. But I've had it so much fun that I'm now working on a novel.
Good.
So we'll see what
Good
happens.
for you. Is it a mystery?
No, it is not, actually. Well, I'm doing the same thing your dad did. Your dad, Tony, really, his plan when he was going to be a writer was to write the great American novel. And he ended up writing a mystery first as a warm-up. And of course, 18 books later, it was hardly a warm-up. He became so successful in the genre. But if you're interested in that, fulfilling that dream, Finding Moon, which is one of his standalone novels, is his attempt to write a more larger literary landscape book. Right. And it's really interesting. And it's too bad Tony isn't here because it would be fun to ask him questions about that because it was so close to his heart.
Yeah, I think today it might be considered more of a thriller.
You're right.
It has those elements.
No, it does have that.
But it doesn't have enough car chases and things going
I think
out,
the reason it was a thriller is because he'd been trained himself so much to write action scenes that it was hard for him to go back to a more passive, domestic, conversation-like novel.
Right.
I still can't read these questions.
Well, we have no new questions yet. So what do you read for fun?
For fun, I'm rereading 84 Charing Cross Road now, and I'm reading a biography about the woman who wrote that. I read mysteries all the time. I just read your Stargazer, well, actually a few months ago. I'm an obsessive reader of newspapers. So probably 20% of my time is nonstop newspaper reading, 4 newspapers every day. And I'm not a position of power. I mean, it really doesn't matter what happens with the devaluation of the coin somewhere halfway around the world. But I still have this habit of reading newspapers, as your dad did.
Yeah, I think that's what happens to journalists.
Yeah, you never, what is it about journals? They fade away or something. Journalists just keep reading other people's copy.
Right.
And tell us about what you're working on. Because you got an audience who's waiting for the next one.
Okay, well, I just finished what could be the last set of corrections on my 7th novel, The Sacred Bridge. And this is the first time I've used Jim Chi as the main crime solver. I was wanting to do that in my 2nd book, Rock with Wings, but Bernie having been Bernadette Manuelito, who was the character for whom I continued this with whom I put on my big girl boots and decided to continue Dad's series. She was not happy being a sidekick, so she and she worked in that book together. Anyway, this is a Jim Chi as the main detective book. It's set in the Lake Powell, Antelope Canyon area, the Navajo Mountain part of the Navajo Reservation. Jim is hiking there. He goes to see Rainbow Bridge, which is a very sacred site to the Navajo and a lot of other Native people. And after that, discovers a body. And I'm not going to say anything else about that. And Bernie, meanwhile, is dealing with complaints about a sort of bootleg farm that was supposed to be growing hemp that seems to be growing something other than hemp in the cannabis family and using too much water after the Navajo Nation approved so much water. So anyway, she gets involved in that story, which turns out to be pretty horrific for her. So I really like this book, and every time I make corrections, I like it even better. And readers will be glad to know it's getting shorter.
Well, you're
so that book will be out that book will be out next April. And then I have one more book on the current contract, one more Bernie Chi, Joe Leaporn book. And I'm really thinking about what I want to do, what that book should be. I planted a lot of seeds in the Sacred Bridge that now I'm going to have to see how they'll come to flowers.
Well, you know, it's not critical of your dad to say that he really hadn't developed Bernie fully. And
Right.
So it's interesting, you know, because your people often introduce you as carrying on Leaporn and She, and in a way you are because you're true to their characters. But much of what we now know about Bernie comes from you.
Yeah.
In the Sinister Pig, she's very important in the story, but you don't get to know her the way you get to know Chi and Leaporn in those books.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe I should ask you this question. Do you think your dad had a hard time writing female figures in his books?
Yep.
No, there's the answer.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that really the best female character he wrote was Emma Leaporn after she had died.
Yes. Oh,
Seeing
it's so
her-
moving.
Yeah, seeing Joe's profound grief is like really I think the first time the reader has a sense of who this character was.
And when she takes the reminiscences going to New York and seeing those sculptures, it's a very touching moment.
Yeah.
So you're right.
And it's interesting because, you know, my dad had a mom, a big sister. He had 2 stepsisters. Then he had 3 daughters, a wonderful wife, a sister-in-law. I don't know why he had trouble with us, but maybe because he was more of an action guy, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah.
So anyway, that if you like following these books and you read the 18 and you're now going through Anne's books, that's one of the strugglingly fun things. Bernie becomes a real person.
Thanks. Yeah, I was lucky. I was really lucky that Dad did not develop her into a full-fledged crime solver, because that gave me a way to continue the series without having to be Tony Hillerman. So I see we have a comment there. Thanks, Jamie and Anne. What a wonderful conversation. Congrats on the book, Jamie, and thank you to Bookworks for hosting.
Oh, that's very nice. And speaking
Yes.
of Bookworks, you should know that tomorrow morning is the official publication date of, this is going to sound like a commercial because it is, of Tony Hillerman, A Life. And there are signed copies awaiting for you when the store opens at 10 o'clock tomorrow? Do you give 10 or is that a 9?
I think it's 9.
Okay, 9 o'clock tomorrow. So you can get in line to get one. And tomorrow is the official publication date of the book after so many years of waiting for it.
Yeah, we open at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay, so the
Great.
books are there signed and waiting for you folks.
Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. And thanks to everyone who tuned in on Zoom. I really appreciate it. And I am just delighted with this book. And it's wonderful to have had a chance to spend an hour with you talking about what's closest to both of our
Right.
hearts.
That's great. And if you have questions that didn't get answered, you'll know that Anne and I are always out and about. If you check our events pages, you'll find that we're a lot. I mean, I'll be in Albuquerque dozens of times, so there'll be an opportunity for you.
Yep, you will have plenty of chances to talk to us both. And we both have websites too, which have emails if you want to send us any questions.
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. This was a lovely evening. Thanks so much.
We're still on. I have to press the thing.
If you want to unmute yourself and just congratulate these two and thank them. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm sorry.
Thank
if
you
I sound
so
like an
much.
echo.
Thank you
I have
very
two
much.
things
Thank
open.
Hey,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look forward to reading it.
Right.
Thanks.
Good night.
Can you tell how many people?
One more button.
There you go.
Okay.
All right.